Welcome back to Night School, episode 7, Song of Myself, part 4. Looks like we'll be talking perhaps parts 11, 12, and 13, or whatever we can get through in about 30 minutes, maybe more, if we really get going. And before we go any further, welcome, Mr. Wes Schantz. Welcome back.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going really well. I'm really happy to be working right now, the day before my birthday, before another podcast tomorrow, and this has been really fun, and I'm looking forward to continuing this project and keep moving forward.
Yeah, we are, at 11 right now? Is it my turn to read?
As far as I'm concerned, yes. And I'll share the screen for the viewers. You can always go to Poetry Foundation and type in Song of Myself too and find it for free. If this doesn't suit your fancy, or you're not on YouTube, you're on Anchor. YouTube is down right now, just to date this, which is very interesting. All right, yes, Mr. Schantz.
All right. So our leisurely stroll through, we're at 11. 28 young men bathed by the shore, 28 young men and all so friendly, 28 years of womanly life and all so lonesome. She owns the fine house by the rise of the bank. She hides handsome and richly dressed, aft the blinds of the window. Which of the young men does she like the best? Ah, the homeliest of them is beautiful to her. Where are you off to, lady? For I see you. You splash in the water there, yet stay stock still in your room. Dancing and laughing along the beach came the 29th bather. The rest did not see her, but she saw them and loved them. The beards of the young men glistened with wet. It ran from their long hair. Little streams passed all over their bodies. An unseen hand also passed over their bodies. It descended tremblingly from their temples and ribs. The young men float on their backs. Their white bellies bulge to the sun. They do not ask who seizes fast to them. They do not know who puffs and declines with pendant and bending arch. They do not think whom they souse with spray.
All right, well, Walt Whitman is certainly starting to earn his reputation in this part, I would say. Well, there's several interesting things I see. Walt starts with anaphora in the very first stanza, 28, 28, 28. And then she. And so we have this description of these men acting in sort of a nymph-like way with a sort of invisible Athena-like or goddess of joy-like figure, perhaps nature, perhaps some figure of relationship between the men, Eros, or sort of an Aphrodite sort of thing going on there. But the most striking part of this part is the imagery itself, with the men put in the role of being viewed in sort of a sensual way, how they look and how the spray affects them in the parts of their body that are, an unseen hand also passed over their bodies, deeply sensual. It descended tremblingly from their temples and ribs. These are places of affectionate touch. And then it's young men float on their backs. And we know from Saigadam and Ogiogos, actually, that youth is the number one sexual indicator for both males and females. So that is actually a very distinct mention right there. And their white bellies, again, something exposed. And they do not know who puffs. And we end, as we began, with anaphora. They do not know who puffs and declines with pendant and bending arch. And again, that language, that bending arch language, just evokes, the lumbar spine and motions in a sensual way. They do not think whom they souse with spray. And I'm not sure actually what to do with the end of that there, Wes, or what you think of what I've had to say, but
Yeah, I think it's, again, referring to her, the watcher's presence among them. And so in a sense, she's there among them in the pool or the river. And so the spray of their splashing around, is also wetting her, who, she's watching so intently that she's the 29th bather.
Yeah, yeah, and that's interesting. Just the little streams passed all over their bodies just to add to that sensual imagery of like which evokes sort of the image of a figure in a shower or something like that. And that the image of say like the water imagery and the sort of shallow or little or glistening water imagery is very much evocative of Aphrodite and the mythology surrounding her being sort of the cast off male parts of Uranus that fell into the ocean, and then from the off air, the foam came forth Aphrodite, indicating that her love is sort of sweet and shallow and superficial and sensual, and that it's skin deep. And even though I do see the sensuality in this piece, I'm not sure whether I see the transcendent
Yeah, I think there's an interesting little parallel there between the myth and the everyday scene.
yet.
And I mean, I think also there's a pretty strong note of pathos where this young woman, 28 years, maybe not so young at that time, is watching from behind the blinds, right? She can't physically be out there with them as much as she might like to, and she's lonesome up there. But that is also an example of the kind of love that Whitman is evoking. And her presence watching, of course, is sort of like our presence watching and listening. And like the poets, right? He says, the eye of the poem at least, where are you off to, lady? For I see you, right? And he's bringing her out there imaginatively. And so he's making the connection, which again, we're sort of also invited to partake in. Um, and as much as it's sensual, it's also sort of innocent in that way, right? It's bringing to fulfillment this unfulfilled desire, and it's sort of like, you know, makes her day.
When I certainly see the romanticism in that aspect in this piece, the sort of upholding of that which is evocative of pathos, or that which produces emotion, or the expression of that which is real experience filled with emotion, is certainly here, and that does make me think that it is sort of poor practice to criticize poetry, seeing it is the artistic expression of someone's experience. And so much better just to understand what it is, much more valuable practice than attempting to criticize without first establishing what it is that the other person was attempting to articulate to you. So, yeah. So, shall we move on to 12?
Go for it.
All right. The butcher boy puts off his killing clothes or sharpens his knife at the stall in the market. I loiter, enjoying his repartee and his shuffle and breakdown. Blacksmiths, with grimed and hairy chests, environ the anvil. Each has his main sledge. They are all out. There is a great heat in the fire. From the cinder-strewed threshold I follow their movements. The lithe shear of their waists plays even with their massive arms. Overhand, the hammers swing, overhand so slow, overhand so sure. They do not hasten. Each man hits in his place.
Cool. So we jump back from the countryside or wherever we were out there in wilderness nature back to the city. The butcher boy might make us think about that imagery of childhood and birth even, right? His killing clothes. This is sort of like our, I guess, stand-in for this scene, right? And the poet is there enjoying a talk with him while sort of, again, watching. Only this time, seems like instead of watching a scene of leisure, we're watching a scene of hard work. But there's a kind of a music to it, right? The beating of the hammers is so rhythmic in the way that it's put together in that line, and the kind of orderliness to it, for all that there's this quality of, I don't know, effort and straining. Everything seems to kind of work together. The lithe, sheer, massive arms, right? And the final line there, each man hits in his place. So I think there's a kind of parallel between these two parts, right? 11 out in the water, 12 by the fire, 11 out in the woods, 12 in the city. They also, they're masculine scenes, right? Watched by somebody who, in this case, not a female, but just a younger boy, and the poet.
Yeah, and I would add to that parallel that just as Aphrodite and Hephaestus were for some time married as a story within the story in the Odyssey, so do you have here the Aphrodite imagery and the water imagery above, and the Hephaestian imagery and the fire imagery below. The blacksmith god, of course, who is not known, however, for his physical beauty. And so that I think is a clear distinction that Walt Whitman is throwing in there for those who've studied epic, that he is making a conscious change here. Hephaestus is known to be the ugliest god. In fact, it's because of his limp in book 1 of the Iliad that he is laughed at by the other gods. And he's cheated on by Aphrodite with Ares in the Odyssey because Ares is better looking than he is. And so to describe the lithe sheer of these wastes as if they are like sort of, predatory cats and all their litheness with their massive arms and their hairy chests is, on the one hand, descriptive language, of course, but within the context of the last two parts, I would say, again, fairly suggestive. This is a very much a loving eye, an eye that cares for the details in an appreciative way. And I would say, just from what it notices and what it brings about in its language and through its language.
Yeah. And in this case, yeah, it's a kind of pleasure in the quality of their craftsman-like work, In the other one, it was a pleasure in the soft serenity of their lazing about, which he also is big on. So, yeah, he sort of finds things to delight in everywhere, to delight in on multiple levels, like from the mythological perhaps, and the sensual, even romantic perhaps, and then just like in the sound of things, the sensory rather than sensual, maybe, to make that distinction.
Well, and if you take what he is doing to be a metaphor for what is happening in this part, overhand the hammers swing, overhand so slow, overhand so sure, they do not hasten, each man hits in his place, that he is a poet, like other poets, like a hammerer amongst hammerers, who though they each do the same job of hammering, this speaks to the poetic mode. They do not hasten, as in they go at their own pace, because language takes time and language has a rhythm, especially this poetry have a rhythm. And each man hits in his place, meaning that even though they have the same job, they're unique too and individuated in some respect. Just like Whitman might be, say, claiming about himself as a craftsman, a master craftsman of language, alongside those who came before, sort of making his place and making his argument for his place, though, pretty speculative at this point.
I think that seems fair. If you think of it in terms of Hephaestus, then that activity of making has long been associated with the poet, and I agree that the emphasis here seems to be on the pace more than maybe even the sound of what's going on. Is sort of the rhythmic motion of the work, and how sort of perfect it is.
Yeah, and just to add to your point about fire and making and poetry as art, as an abstract form of making by means of fire, in one of your earlier podcasts, I was listening to today, you talked about the Promethean fire or the Luciferian morning star-like fire, the rational consciousness that man has from God, or whatever one wants to call it, that which the prefrontal cortex allows. But just something interesting about that is that in Dante's Inferno, Canto 26 is the canto of fire in the Inferno, where the deceitful counselors are, including Ulysses, who is the maker-up of fables. And he's paralleled by Arnaud Daniel, who actually gets to speak in his native language of Provençal, which is a high honor for a poet to write a poet in his own language when he's beginning another. And then, of course, the ultimate maker of language is in Canto 26 of the Paradiso, near the source or fire. That's Adam. And so fire and language and poetry, you're quite right that it has a rich mythological and epic tradition behind it. And it's funny that we can get all of that out of just these three little stanzas.
Right on. It's fun.
Speaking of language, we have some language coming up here. And I would say that, and I wonder if you agree with this, that it's important to read the poetry for what it means and not to invoke modern pretensions about language onto it and to make claims about it that are patently untrue, as if it were written in the time with the same mores or the same language conventions as are currently upheld. I feel like that's like judging somebody's style from this time of clothing and being like, look how ridiculous they look right now. It's like, well, obviously we're very different now. We speak very differently. It's like, that's the difference.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's like learning any language, right? That this is the language of the time, and well, we're going to read it and we're going to talk about it. So here goes. 13. The Negro holds firmly the reins of his 4 horses. The block swags underneath on its tied-over chain. The Negro that drives the long dray of the stone-yard, steady and tall he stands, poised on one leg on the string piece. His blue shirt exposes his ample neck and breast and loosens over his hip band. His glance is calm and commanding. He tosses the slouch of his hat away from his forehead. The sun falls on his crispy hair and mustache, falls on the black of his polished and perfect limbs. I behold the picturesque giant and love him, and I do not stop there. I go with the team also. In me, the caresser of life, wherever moving, backward as well as forward slewing, to niches aside and junior bending, not a person or object missing, absorbing all to myself and for this song. Oxen that rattle the yoke and chain or halt in the leafy shade, what is it that you express in your eyes? It seems to me more than all the print I have read in my life. My tread scares the wood drake and the wood duck on my distant and day-long ramble. They rise together, they slowly circle around. I believe in those winged purposes and acknowledge red, yellow, white playing within me, and consider green and violet and the tufted crown intentional, and do not call the tortoise unworthy because she is not something else, and the jay in the woods never studied the gamut, yet trills pretty well to me, and the look of the bay mare shames silliness out of me.
That's interesting that he should end with saying shames silliness out of me, because this does seem to be a fairly silly part, and that he starts off with, again, I would say this fairly sensual description of a large man who has a commanding look, an ample neck and breast, like he's describing a woman, and describes his hip band and his polished and perfect limbs, and he is a picturesque giant, and I love him. It's unclear exactly who loves him, but again, very, very much appreciative language of that which is physical and beautiful to the person perceiving. And then all of a sudden we have this shift in me, the caresser of life, seemingly a feminine image of nature, wherever moving, backward as well as forward slewing, to niches aside and junior bending, not a person or object missing, absorbing all to myself and for the song. That almost makes me think that this is directly from Walt Whitman, and that this is like the nature or the movement of muse in him as a poet, and that he is summoned back to himself in order to express why he has these experiences and what he is doing when he has these experiences, absorbing all to myself and for this song, as if everything that he has ever observed is in order to be re-articulated through this epic, as if all his life is being poured into this. And then that oxen that rattle the yoke and chain, that evokes epic imagery from both the Aeneid as well as the Iliad, and of course the Odyssey, the oxen of the sun, just to go back with the idea of a sunlight, fire imagery with consciousness and language. But also the yoke and chain, again, like the hammer imagery, there's a freedom, but also now an enslavement to something. In order to get work done, you have to partially enslave yourself, sort of like Jacob with Leah and Rachel. What Peterson often says about the period of apprenticeship, or where you have to essentially be a slave to develop the skills necessary to do something, and then you have true freedom. That seems to be the idea behind the liberal arts too. But also we move away from sort of, and we haven't seen this in the last couple parts, but there is no evidence again of like the Christian or spiritual imagery, like God, angels, spirits, or anything. But we get back to this natural transcendence, that something in the eyes of an ox, a dumb ox, expresses something much deeper and truer than anything ever expressed in language in a book, something dead and no longer living. And then we get a description of the wood drake, which I love is the name of the male duck, and the wood duck rising together and circling around another image of the perfection of nature. I believed in those winged purposes. That's so interesting, the winged there, because he must have known Homer to say that people speak winged words. And so it's interesting that what he's emphasizing here are not the deeds of man, but the sort of beauties of nature. And so the description of a bird, and again, this is a male bird, and consider green and violet, the tufted crown, intentional. Do not call the tortoise unworthy, because she is not something else. And the jay in the woods, never studied the gamut, yet trills pretty well to me. And so there's something as if looking at nature will teach you more than any book. Yeah.
The looks of the ox and then of the bay mare, right? It's teaching you something, but it's something inarticulate, right? And so that's kind of a challenge to a poet, right? Because that's his whole thing, is that he gets to attach words and sing, right? So it seems like and it's interesting, yeah, shames silliness out of me. It's the closest thing to a lack of total confidence that maybe we've heard, right? Like that there is something that he should be ashamed of, that he's still in a way working on. But the way that he says it is, of course, with consummate artistry, right? It makes a beautiful poetic line, and it creates this awesome conclusion to this bit of his poetic structure, where it started with the team of horses and their driver, and it kind of morphed through a few different images, and then it ends up back with the look of that one horse, right? It's really nicely balanced.
Yeah.
It's playful, but also serious.
And it's interesting too, because I suppose I should have looked twice and a little closer, because if you look very closely at that last stanza, the language of faith is in there. I believe in those winged purposes. That could be I believe, language of belief. And then winged purpose, that's something intangible or substantial, but not material, like a principle or an article of faith. And then plain, tufted crown, intentional. And consider the green and violet and the tufted crown, intentional. That's interesting, because intention within nature indicates an argument for a maker or something directing that. Intention denotes consciousness, or rather implies consciousness. There we are. And then the idea of shame coming through from this natural object. So again, another fairly religious notion, but not simply notion, reality that's spoken about with religious language because of just how real and painful shame is. That's sort of interesting too, because one thing I was going to say against Whitman is that perhaps in studying human nature, which is what Dante claims in the Purgatorio, you study nature in the best possible way, because he essentially directly makes the claim in the Purgatorio that it is by means of exploring a human and understand the complexities of a human that you best explore the world, because humans are the world for you as a social creature.
Right, right. Yeah, it's interesting that the locus of attention does always sort of circle back around to the speaker himself, um, and it's like connected to this beautiful play of various images, which he holds up to us with kind of incredible clarity, but ultimately it resolves in this kind of deep study of his own perspective, his own attitude, his own consciousness, and yeah, I mean,
Right, because without him,
he's
none of this exists.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, he's the one who, you could just as well read that, right? I believe, right? Or you emphasize it's his contention or something like that. But believe in, yeah, that phrase does seem to have a kind of faith quality to it, which is very interesting.
And then all the sentences, I just understood the reason for the anaphora, are then connected back to that I. And. It's a long chain. All those thoughts and beliefs and experiences are the ego, or the conscious mind perceiving. Or I think, it's I, and then of course it ends with me, right? There are three me's at the end of lines here, but it begins with the subject and it ends with the object. And a prepositional phrase. It's the object of the preposition out of me.
Well, something sneaky is going on there too, because in the first 1, 2, 3, 4 lines, there's a verb attached to the I, but it shifts because then at the next one, it's not him doing it anymore, right? Now it's just him observing, but he sort of slides it in there. And the J, it's a new subject, in the woods, never studied the gamut, yet trills pretty well to me. And I like what you said. Yeah, he shifts himself into the place of object, but also at the end of the line, which is a place of power, just like the beginning of the line. And the look of the bay mare shames. So again, new subject, verb for that subject, and he is there at the end. That's pretty cool. That's kind of sneaky, though. I don't know.
Yeah, these poets, they're pretty crafty guys. That's why we put people, deceitful counselors, right? Ulysses. But, it's funny because it makes me think again of the connection that he's making to sort of the existential tradition. And let's get this right this time. The maxim of Protagoras that man is the measure of all things. We couldn't get that right last time. I was like Pythagoras, and I think you said Parmenides, and then you found out that it was Protagoras. And
this is why the internet's handy. Yeah, gotta have it.
Because it begins with I, it ends with me. It begins with the person as subject, it ends with the person as object, and that forms a complete whole, an alpha and omega, suggesting that sort of the reception and the giving of information by humans, and that process is that which is divine about humans, or our unique adaptation to the world, and thus is that which we might call our divine ability, or that which we share with God or God. So I think there's a lot to that stanza.
I think it's interesting then, if you look at it that way, then to think about the structure starting with the Negro holding the reins of the horses, right? In a way, he's the alpha of this part 13. And so he's being paralleled again with the poet, right? The poet is also in control and yet also dependent on these forces which are even greater than his, giant strength are these horses and oxen, things which have their own intelligence, perhaps their own intention, which he can tell is there, and can't, can only kind of wonder what is it that it expresses. Um, it's it's a pretty cool uh, thing to think about, how we haven't really heard any of these people or images say anything yet.
Hmm.
Right? There hasn't been that I remember, at least, there hasn't been any dialogue so far. The speaker is the only one speaking on behalf of, but also listening to all of what he's observed. Um, and that'd be something kind of interesting to watch for, like, where do we hear anyone else's voice actually represented, or do we? Is it all filtered through the observation and perception of the speaker?
Yeah, that's fascinating. And to what extent does poetry distill down information to such an extent that, even full conversations are a line, right? When he's like, when he mentioned in the last part, I loiter enjoying his repartee and his shuffle and breakdown of the butcher boy. It's like, that's an entire conversation right there. That's a lot of time and a lot of information being shared, and yet it's distilled down to that extent. And just sort of on another bit, I'm glad you brought the attention to the Negro holding the four horses, because that just reminds me of both a mythological reference and also a philosophical one. The mythological one being Phaethon or Phaethon, the son of Apollo, who's half mortal, who tries to steer his chariot and with his horses and ends up getting attacked by Draco, sun burning forever, the Ethiopians, and then gets struck by a lightning bolt by Zeus. If you can't handle the poetic power, well, you might get hit by a lightning bolt, or, deprived of your wits. And but if you can master in sort of a Phaedrus-like way, or Phaedrus-like way from Plato, he describes that the nous, or the mind, is supposed to, alongside the spirit, or the spirited part of the soul, which is represented as a horse drawing along a chariot, where the nous, or the mind, is, alongside the ugly, ignoble horse, which is desires, which always goes in a different way. If you can train it by pulling on the bit so hard that it bleeds, and so that it can keep up, then you can be in control. And so it's sort of like suggesting that the poet, or the epic poet, is somebody who sort of gets themselves in order, or puts their motivational systems in order in such a way as they can express, their perspective from the seat of each of these, and can articulate the sum of these experiences, as if the motivational systems are within you, like hunger, desire for sex, desire for status, desire to be clean, or whatever all the basic motivational systems are. I think there are 7 or so. We can look them up at some point. But if you can harness those and then articulate your perspective when you are in the thralls of one of those, perhaps you can express something of profound value.
Yeah, it's I mean, it invites, interpretations, perhaps even on that scientific level, of something that would have been completely unknown at the time, but with further study, maybe it did have it sort of in a germ form here, in the prophetic power of the poet. Who knows?
Yes, the Sybil Trelawney power of the poet, which Miss Sarah Miller does not care for at all. Well, so we're at 34 minutes right now. What do you think?
Let's call it a night, because
Cool.
the next one, we get an answer to my question. We hear someone else talk. It's the goose, or sorry, the gander says ya honk. So that'll be for next time.
All right. Well, can't wait to see that. Yeah, that'll be fun. Okay. Well, another good day, and listeners, keep listening in. We are now officially 1/4 of the way through this poem.
Yeah.
One season through, so we've just moved from spring to summer. I suppose. Yeah. So yeah, good work. Yeah, celebrations all around.
All right.
All
Till
right.
next time.
Till next time. Bye, Night Scholars.